Hello and welcome to another Dissident pod from the Dissident Club here in Stockholm, Sweden. Uh, today, I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by the British journalist Johnny Miller, who is currently in Moscow and is seeking asylum there for various amounts of reasons. So you could say it's a classic dissident that I will be talking to today. And I thought it best that you perhaps introduce yourself, Mr. Miller. I know you from X, and but I
Yeah,
don't think our listeners they might have missed you. So please.
sure. I've been a journalist, I guess, specializing in conflicts for a long time now. I reported in Syria, Libya, conflicts in Africa, Asia. And I kind of stopped for 5 years because after Syria, I told myself no more war. But when the Ukraine war started, like many of us, we knew what was going to happen. That ultimately, Europe's actions of carrying on the war, trying to fight Russia, persuading Ukraine to fight instead of make peace, would damage British and European interests. And that, of course, is what we're seeing, fighting to the last Ukrainian, etc. So I originally went to Kiev when the Russians were surrounding it. So I was there only for a couple of days before I realized I had to leave because, my views are very open, that I'm very critical of the NATO position. And it just wasn't safe for journalists like that. Journalists are being disappeared, and I've been violently deported from two other countries actually in the Middle East. So I know how quickly the net can close. So I scarpered and left Ukraine, and then I applied to go to the Russian side, and I was able to get in because I was working for Press TV, the Iranian English language service. They asked me to go, so that was it. That got me the access to Donbass with accreditation from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Press TV promotes peace in Europe. It's the same angle as me. So then I went to Donbass, and I spent, I guess, about 2 years on and off in Donbass and in Crimea. And then, as my work got bigger and bigger and bigger, the threats got more extreme. The phone hacking, threatening loved ones, it got even more extreme than that. And so I ended up being scared to leave Russia, fearing imprisonment or worse back in Britain or elsewhere. Because the threats of the journalists who worked in Donbass are extreme. People might think that I'm exaggerating them, but they're extreme, and the threats are very real. So I was granted political asylum in Russia, and that's where I've been. So I've been in Moscow under asylum for a year now, exactly, actually. And yeah, that's the situation.
So this is basically a way then for Western and Ukrainian governments to stifle the ability for us Westerners to get any credible information from the Russian side in the conflict. When you were doing your reporting from the Russian side and the Donbass, what were your experiences? What was the Ukrainian Russian view on the war at that time? Did you see any of
Well,
these atrocities that have been claimed to happen, or what was your general perception of the situation
yeah,
back then?
I covered Maidan in 2014, the coup or the revolution, whatever you want to call it, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in Maidan and Kiev. And I went to Donbass as well when the conflict started back in 2014. So I know the region pretty well. And I remember being in Maidan in Kiev with thousands of people protesting against the government. And my Ukrainian translator asked me, "What do you think of all of this?" And I said, "It won't end well." You had this alliance of foreign money, oligarchs, and ultra-nationalist extremists trying to overthrow the Ukrainian government. And of course, it's been a disaster for Ukraine. Ukraine before was a corrupt country, but it had democracy, and it sort of pivoted back and forth between the West and Russia. But after Maidan, it became a extremely pro-Western and anti-Russian state. The East in Donbass rose. Russia took Crimea. And so, I know Donbass very, very well. when I was back there, I was 24 in 2014. I'd say about 70% of people supported Russia. The ethnic Russians, they all speak Russian and they support Russia. When the special military operation or the invasion, whatever you want to call it, started, that was down. That was now about 95% pro-Russian, because over the last 8 years, where there's been a kind of intermittent civil war between Donbass and Ukraine, the Ukrainians have left. So in Donbass, people are overwhelmingly pro-Russian. So, in Donbass, people call it the liberation operation when Russia moved in. And there was a great excitement at the beginning because everyone thought this war was going to be over quickly. But of course it wasn't. And it's still going on, although Donetsk is pretty safe now. But in Donetsk, a lot of my work over the first year was reporting on the Ukrainian shelling of the people of Donetsk. And most of the time, it's people are being killed because they're too close to the front and accidentally, but also Ukrainians. And I don't know if that was ordered by the Ukrainian government or just extremist units would just lob shells into the center, hit schools, all the rest of it. I almost got killed numerous times, even just on a Sunday trying to take the day off at my local cafe, bombs landing right outside. And so it's very clear the people of Donbass overwhelmingly want to be part of Russia. And that was my argument for the first year or so of my reporting, was that there is a peace agreement to be had in Ukraine by listening to the people of Donbass. That Ukraine will never be able to take back Donbass. That's clear to everybody now. It was clear to many of us at the beginning. And that a just peace would include people of Donbass getting what they want, which is initially being independent, but now being part of Russia.
So this is basically information that would have been valuable to receive here within the European Union, of course. But this has been made difficult for numerous reasons. One, like you yourself said, that you have been having difficulties and even applied now for asylum in Russia. I'm also thinking about the EU sanctions that you have had colleagues in Moscow. I'm thinking about the German nationals Thomas Röper and Alina Lipp, and also the Turkish journalist Hussein Dogru, who have been sanctioned by the European Union as individuals without any possibility really to appeal. Within this so-called, if I want to call it, journalistic expat community in Russia, is there what are the feelings amongst you and your colleagues? Is it one of anger? Is it one of bitterness? Is it one of just resignation? Can you handle this? All these feelings against your former home countries that I think probably all of you held at a certain amount of esteem previously.
Yeah,
how have you dealt with being let down so much by the EU, who speaks about freedom and freedom of expressions, but then behaves in this certain way?
No, I think it's different for everybody. I've struggled a lot over the last, my last 3 years of my life, been incredibly exciting, and I'm very proud of my work. And but at the same time, it has been very, very tough. I'm good friends with Alina Lipp, who's a German-Russian journalist. And to give you an example, we stayed together for a while. We're good friends, and she messaged me at one point and said, "Johnny, have you heard about Adrien Bouquet?" Adrien Bouquet was a French military blogger who also worked with the Donbass militias. And he went to Istanbul and was followed by people in the street and stabbed. So that's the kind of, and I interviewed him in Donetsk when he got away and then fled back to Russia. And so, I interviewed him in a hotel in Donetsk, and he told me the story, and it's chilling. And I'm suddenly listening to this thinking, God, I thought only Russians and Ukrainians were getting assassinated in this war. But now there's a French guy, a military blogger, who's also in Donbass, just like me. And there's reasons I've never worked for the Russians or Donbass. He did. So there's a reason he might be seen as a legitimate target. But that's the kind of, to give you a story of what it's like for alternative journalists on the Russian side. We're messaging each other when people are killed or almost killed. When the Ukrainians assassinated journalists in Russia, we messaged each other and think, shit, excuse my language. And then, of course, people get sanctions. You know, I first met Alina Lip when she was just received her court order. She was in Donbass, and the Germans sent her a court order, 3 years in jail, if she ever returned, all for just trying to tell the truth about what's happening in Donbass. And then, of course, a year later or so, she's sanctioned by the EU. There's a British guy in Donbass as well, a blogger. He's been sanctioned by the British government. So there's all these attempts to close down people. And the threat, for me, I haven't had anything like that yet. Because I'm careful about my work. I'm very professional in my work. It's very difficult for them to justify. They can't make the case that I'm not a very professional journalist, because I am, and I know how much respect my work has got, even with mainstream people. I know mainstream people follow me on X, and I speak to them. So it's very hard for them to sanction me and accuse me of being some kind of whatever. So, but this problem goes right throughout Europe. I don't know Sweden too well. But why in Europe, the amount of people I know, because I speak to them, who think exactly like I think, people in mainstream journalism, politics, all the rest of it, but they don't speak out. Why? Because they will go for you. If you're an academic, they will try to make you lose your job, which is the end of your world, really. How do you feed your family? That's happened to some British academics who shut up very quickly because they felt the pressure of losing their jobs. As a mainstream journalist, because of my work the last few years, my last work before coming to Donbass was a piece for the BBC. I'll never work again in the mainstream. I don't care, because I felt that the saving of European lives and the promotion of British and European interests in this conflict was more important than anything else. But for most people, it's losing your jobs, and they'll go after you other ways, like the people you mentioned. They can't make them lose their jobs because they don't have jobs in mainstream, if you like, in politics. So how else do you go for those people? How do you shut them up? Well, can we go through legal routes? If we sanction them, will that make their life more difficult and stop their work? The amount of extreme death threats I've had, I've got 10 different phones at home to stop the hacking, because they can't sanction me because my work is very professional. They write stuff about me to make my work difficult, but they hack my phones and do all sorts of stuff. And then, how many political assassinations do we see? Whether it's Charlie Kirk, whether it's Slovakian presidents, how many assassinations do we see for all sorts of? We look at what the Israelis do to journalists in Gaza, just kill them. So there's all different ways to silence people, and that's why you've almost had apart from great people like yourselves, speaking out against NATO's disastrous policies, because people are scared to speak out because they'll try to ruin your life through it.
Yes, unfortunately, it's a situation we've come to. And speaking of that, what's your feeling on why we have come to this point? Because if you look back throughout history and especially then history on journalism and reporting, for example, during the Vietnam War, you had American journalists working within the North Vietnamese area. Later, you've had or embedded and critical towards the American position. You had Robert Fisk, for example, who moved with ease across the different lines of conflict. There seems to have been a hardening in relation to journalists not being allowed to be objective. And by that I mean it's as if journalists nowadays have to pick a side. And if you don't pick a side, you will be brushed aside as a so-called alternative propagandist or whatever. Is this due to the fact that the newspaper companies really can't control information anymore? Or why do you think this hardening of the demands on journalists having to pick a side has come about during these last decades?
It's not been easy for me to report in Russia now, but a Russian official once told me, said, Johnny, you need to choose sides. Because my work has always been, people see me as a pro-Russian journalist. I'm the most pro-European journalist there is. But of course, you're reporting from this side of the conflict, and your stories tend to be more sympathetic to the Russians. Most Russian people I meet, they kind of support the conflict. in Donbass. People hate the Ukrainians. It's Ukrainian shells killing civilians on the side that I am. So, it depends very much what side of the conflict you're on, what the material you put out as a journalist is a lot. But no, I mean, you give examples of the Vietnam War, and yeah, probably there were better journalists back then who were able to do better work. And we've seen that certainly in recent years, the quality of journalism, because of the editors and who owns the press, etc., definitely plummet. But I'll give you one example. I wrote a short piece about this one time. There was a famous French-American journalist in Vietnam. He was known as the best American journalist in Vietnam. And during the war, he started to be critical and saying that, look, America's not going to win this war. We can't win it. And decades later, the then Secretary of State, Colin Powell, read his book and said, we should have listened to this guy, But what happened to him? The FBI started investigating him because he started saying, look, we're not going to win this war. And so the FBI investigating him, but really he was just doing his job. And it's the same thing what I have done. I was in Donetsk when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was about to start, the disastrous 2023 counteroffensive, and everyone was saying, this is going to be great. We're going to take back Crimea. And I'm there on the front lines, and I see, and I wrote, I don't make many predictions. Predictions often make fools of men, but I said very clearly, and I said many, many times, and I wrote it, the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive will be a disaster. It will be an utter disaster. And I thought they'd actually have more success than they did, but they practically had none, and it was a disaster. So why am I facing all this persecution when I simply got things right? If the British and the Europeans and the Ukrainians had listened to me, instead of hacking my phones and threatening to kill me and my loved ones, the Ukrainian and British and European positions would be better off. But they see this, any kind of journalist who steps outside the lines as an enemy, and that's what it is in war. I see. Look at the Israelis; they just slaughter journalists because the information war is very, very important. And so when a journalist, how many journalists are killed, imprisoned, all the rest of it, because when journalists make a real impact, whether you take on Mexican drug cartels or Russian oligarchs or NATO, they will go for you to silence you. But there has been a real failure of journalism, and I know now things are starting to change a wee bit. Now I know because I speak to people, even the editors of Western papers are starting to realize, okay, Ukraine can't win this war. So you're starting to see some articles come out about this. But I think the importance of actually seeing, because so many journalists are just propagandists, and in a sense we all are propagandists. In Russia, propaganda traditionally isn't seen as a bad word. It's just putting your political perspective. And every journalist has an angle. If journalists who say they don't have an angle, it's lying. I have an angle. I've always been very clear about my angle, that there should be peace in Ukraine. It's not in British and European interest. But I'm clear about that. But I do professional, honest work. But yes, I do have an angle. So, but I think it's the importance of listening to people like Robert Fisk, some of these great journalists in the past, seeing journalism as a civic duty and a value rather than as a threat, I think is important for European governments.
Yes, it's very true. And one of the problems here in Sweden is that it's within the mainstream media, there's only one angle that's allowed to be presented within the public service sphere. If they had allowed, for example, for you to be on a Swedish public service and give your view or take, then you could have competing angles and the people would have been allowed to draw their own conclusions. But it seems that this is what they are afraid of. They don't trust the ability of the citizens to draw their own conclusions from what they hear. So therefore they have to silence it for whatever reason. Perhaps there's no real profit in peace, which is one theory. But going back to Europe and the EU, I believe you are a very pro Europe in the sense that you believe in the idea of Europe as as a area united and somehow joined by a joint history and a culture that you admire as such. What do you what's your main critique of the current situation in one your own home country of United Kingdom and also of the European Union?
Yeah,
Where do you see it? Where did it go
yeah.
wrong, or
I mean,
where does it go wrong?
I love Europe, and even as I get older, I love Europe more because it's my home. I've fought in conflicts around the world, and I love places around the world. Africa, Asia. Um, but I focused on this one because it's my home. It's Europe. I was thinking recently, Russia's in my top five favorite European countries after Scotland, where I'm from, France, Italy, Greece, and I have a great affection for Russia as well. Sweden's great. I like Sweden. Been there a few times. But I have a love for Europe. I think it's the greatest continent, the best continent in the world. The different cultures we have, the beauty of the cities. I think it's just it's a wonderful place, and it saddens me so much to see the mistakes that Europe is making. And I'm a left wing journalist, but I'm pretty socially conservative at the same time, especially as I get older. Um, but I think Europe is making extreme mistakes, and the Ukraine war is one of the main, certainly top two or three mistakes that they have been making and continue to make. Trump is trying to make peace at the moment, and the Europeans are trying to block it. For what? Because they're living in a fantasy world that Ukraine can win. And I think the real problem, I think I've lost a few followers recently on X when I talk about patriotism. And I think patriotism really is the only thing that can save Europe at the moment. I do have some respect for Donald Trump. He's risking his life, and he sees the importance of reinvigorating American patriotism. And I think Europe needs to do the same thing. You look in Russia, people are just as corrupt in Russia as they are in Europe, all around the world, right? But there is a patriotism that runs through the Russian government. They say that Russia's only allies are its army and its navy. I'd say that's true. The importance of patriotism, and that patriotism is pushed by the government, religion as well, which I think is important. But in Europe, Europe seems to be run by whatever you want to call them, globalists, big corporations, foreign media ownership. I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but in Britain, most of the media owners are foreign and run by foreign companies, foreign billionaires. And you look at our British Prime Minister, is he really running things? And I think you have this business elite in Europe, which is not acting in the interests of European people. I think you said to me you wanted to speak about the immigration situation as well. And I think that's part of it, that European elites are not acting in the interests of British and European people. And I think that's what needs to change.
It could well be. I often make, being of a legal historic background, I often make comparisons to the time before the First World War within Europe, where you had competing empires and you had autocrats who were not really looking to the interests of the individual nations, and somehow they were looking to produce some sort of bloodletting of the European population in order to basically pacify the ability to create change within the European society on a positive note, a positive change. And what scares me today is that there are already forces in play who are wanting to push for a war with the final goal of dismantling Russia, creating a new Yugoslavian situation within the different regions of Russia. And as we know, but perhaps not all listeners, Russia is a federation, and it's a federation of many religions, many cultures, a myriad of minorities, but somehow still holding together. you now living in Russia, what would you say is the has this war, because here in the West there's always talk about Putin is very weakened by the war. The middle classes will rebel against Putin. It has the war in a sense weakened the Russian government, or has it somehow unified the federation? Uh, is there a general opinion on that, or is it
I
very
think
much quid pro quo, or
I think it's
anything you can
stayed
say about
about.
it?
I think it's kind of stayed about the same. I mean, you know, my job is essentially, as a foreign correspondent, if you like. My job is to explain this strange foreign land to people, back in Europe mainly. I think that's my main target audience. And so it's not really relevant what I think of Putin. What matters is what the Russian people think of Putin. And over the last, and his popularity seems to go between about 60 and 80%, which is incredibly high. And in my experience, most of the time I've asked Russian people about Putin, they just shrug and say, oh, he's done a good job. Who else is there? Because over the last 20 or 25 years, he's done it. Russia has improved enormously. In the 90s, I have Russian friends in the 90s. It was a gangster hellhole, Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was just crime, corruption, all the rest of it. Boris Yeltsin left office with a 1% approval rating, apologizing to the nation. But then over the last 25 years, Russia has done very well economically. And anybody who's been to Russia knows that Moscow, St. Petersburg, wonderful cities, wealthy, very clean, two of the great world cities, two of the great European cities. There's great disparity between rich and poor. Russia is a capitalist state. It's state capitalism. So there's a huge amount of problems. We could do a whole show about criticism of Russia, if you like. Russian people obviously have a lot of criticisms, but ultimately the government remains popular. The economy is stable, and that's why what I knew from the start, and why I've done what I've done for the last 3 years, because the British and European strategy has been very clear. They've admitted it: force the overthrow of the Russian government, collapse the economy, and try to break the country up into different states in order to exploit their resources. That's it. And so that's fair strategy. I mean, that makes sense as a strategy. My argument always has been that they're not going to succeed, because ultimately the Russian state is strong enough. Even when Putin leaves, there'll be somebody else, because the security state is so powerful in Russia, and they're in a strong position, and they have the support of people, and that attempt to overthrow the Russian government, destroy it, break it up, steal their resources, put in a pro-Western oligarch, is not going to succeed, in my view. And Europe is destroying itself for bad policy. They've miscalculated, and partly they've miscalculated because of a complete lack of understanding of Russia. And that's why it's important to listen to people who do understand Russia. So I do my best.
Yes, I actually lived in Russia in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
I was there
Is it as
working
bad
on
as people tell me, or?
it was bad. Yes, it was bad. It was it wasn't total societal collapse, but it was a situation where there was a strain on the majority of the population, and there was hardships that was going around. If you were an expat, I was a language teacher at different Russian companies who wanted to integrate their senior management into a Western milieu, so to speak. It wasn't that uncomfortable, but of course I had mornings in my apartment by the Fontanka in Petersburg. You had absolutely no electricity, and everything was frozen. I could basically go ice skating within the apartment, and that was me still being able to pay for a gas heater and things like that. So it was difficult, and the Russians who saw how things were deconstructed, how their um, resources were squandered, it was easy for me to understand. And then I moved to Moscow, and I lived down by the Gagarin monument in Moscow, in one of those a huge apartment block with a babushka on the first floor, always looking very, very angry, no matter what time or day or night. Uh, but when I left, it was quite easy for me to realize when Putin came to power and what Putin started to do. I realized from my time in St. Petersburg when I read about him when he worked with Sobchak, I realized he's probably going to be very much appreciated. And a lot of my friends from that time in Russia said that, yeah, he's going to do quite good. But while my friends in the West said, Putin is turning more and more totalitarian, and why do you think they keep voting for him? I said anyone who experienced those eras or that decade of the 90s will keep a trust in Putin. So that is probably why the Western shenanigans have focused on a very young generation, because the younger generation in Russia didn't really live through those so-called Western liberal heaven that turned out to be a hell during the 1990s. So there is, I think there is still a perception within certain elements of the European Union policymakers that Russians believe that there is still an allure that you can drag them back into the West. But I mean, that time is past.
Yeah, I think Russia has won the propaganda war in Russia. When the
Yes.
war started, there were a lot of Russians looking at YouTube with their children, all the rest of it, all this pro-Ukrainian stuff coming up. I met numerous people who said they were against the war, the Russians' actions when they started. But now they either go and volunteer in Donbass, or they start to realize, oh, actually, NATO does want to destroy us. They want to break us up. And now all the Westerners hate us. So I think there has been a change and a sort of reinvigoration of patriotism for Russia. But at the same time, you have a lot of liberals. I go to the bar near me, and more than a couple of times, you have these Russian people saying, "Oh, you're very critical of the war, critical of Russian soldiers." People think Russia's a totalitarian state. So I've been to a totalitarian state. I won't mention which one in the Middle East, where people are scared to speak. People are literally, they'd say something and they'd be looking around their shoulder to say if anybody heard. Russia's not like that. You can criticize. Probably not wise to criticize a Russian soldier to his face in a bar. But, people can criticize as much as they want. But at the same time, there is huge state control of the politics and the press. But I look at it this way. In Europe, we look at America and we think, wow, America's crazy. And I love America, by the way, as a country. We look at America and think it's crazy, all this homelessness, no restrictions on party donations. It's like completely free democracy. It's like anything goes in America. And we Europeans are much more socialist in our outlook. So we look at America and think, well, crazy people, But Europeans are much more socialist. Russia takes that to another level. So there is traditionally more state control of the politics and the press. But as you said before, one of the most important things for Russia is keeping the whole country together. And if you didn't have that control, you'd have oligarchs running it. You also have the oligarchs remain very powerful, but you have oligarchs running it, or pro-Western oligarchs. To run the state, and every state is run in terms of their culture, the timing, the evolution, with a different political system. Russia, if you go to St. Petersburg, there's three, probably maybe the biggest flags in the world when you cross a bridge. And they have three ginormous flags. I don't know how big they are, but they're huge. One of the imperialist Russia, the yellow, black, and white, I think it is. One of the Soviet Union, the communist flag. And now the Russian Federation. It's the different strands of their political history going back 500 years. And so, this is the Russian Federation now, and it's doing a good job for its people by all the metrics.
Yes, I agree with that, and I was when you had that other failed Ukrainian push that was made, sadly, concerning since there were so many killed on the Ukrainian side, the Kursk incursion into the Kursk area. And I remember thinking, if I worked in the Kremlin, or if I worked within the Russian government with media, or with, basically propaganda, and I woke up and someone called me and said, we have German-made tanks rolling towards Kursk. I would have said, okay, fine, I'm going on a vacation to Sochi. I'll be back in 2 months because you won't be needing me. And by that, I mean, basically the propaganda worked itself. That
Was,
one, I mean, Ukraine were pushing into towards Kursk. They were doing so with German-produced materials. Every Russian, even, I mean, if you're critical to the war, would quickly get a feeling of, wait a minute, this has happened before and it wasn't good. So sometimes I can't for the life of me think what were the Ukrainians and the British, if they were involved, that has later been claimed, what were they thinking?
well, yeah.
It's like serving something on a silver platter for the Russian government to use in communicating with its citizens.
Well, in the whole war, the British are. I've seen these claims that there's probably a lot of truth to them. The British are hugely involved in directing the Ukrainian war effort, perhaps even more so than the Americans. American money was American money, and very much British advisors on the ground. But the problem is for Ukraine is that they've always had, about a 1% chance of winning winning the war. The most dangerous time for Russia was when, if you remember, Prigozhin and the Wagner group, they left their positions in Donetsk and then did their mad march to Moscow. That was an insane time in Russia. When, for your viewers, if you don't know about it, the private military group Wagner, very famous, and their leader Prigozhin, very charismatic guy, was annoyed at the Russian Ministry of Defense for not giving them enough ammunition. So he took about, I can't remember how many, 5,000 or 50,000 soldiers, was driving them in this kind of Mad Max convoy to Moscow and said, we're gonna confront the Ministry of Defense. And so Russia couldn't let this happen. And then essentially Russia had to send in the Air Force to start attacking this convoy, their own soldiers. And so then finally Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, intervened and said, look, Prigozhin, come see me. We need to have peace. And then, of course, about a month later, Prigozhin his plane was mysteriously shot down after leaving Moscow, and he was killed. So that was a huge, almost, that could have been almost civil war in Russia. So the British particularly look at that moment and think we need to recreate that. The only way Ukraine can win this, we're not going to win an attritional warfare. We need some shock that will somehow bring down the Russian government. So I think that's what Kursk was largely about. They tried to push up, they tried to take a nuclear power plant. There was also a serious stories out that the Ukrainians were going to kill Putin. I thought it'd be pretty much impossible to kill Putin, but that was reported in the mainstream American press, and that was called off. So I think they were trying. When you have very little chance of a war, you get desperate and you do desperate things, and that's what that Kursk operation was, leading to huge death for the Ukrainians. But you get desperate. In terms of the whole propaganda, it does seem to me the British have tried to win this war through pure propaganda, because the British don't really have much of an army. They don't really have much of an industry anymore compared to Russia. But they do have powerful intelligence agencies and powerful propaganda techniques. And there's been a huge, that's part of the attacks against me, to silence me. I don't see myself as too important, but my work became a real threat. And so there's extreme measures taken to silence me, because they tried to win this propaganda war, to almost say that Ukraine will win. It's inevitable that Ukraine win, and try to sort of make that fantasy into a reality. There was even a piece by the Daily Telegraph near the start of the war in which they claimed you could change reality. Scott Ritters, the American journalist, has written about this as well. You can somehow make reality by pushing a fantasy and making it real. I mean, it sounds absurd, but that's that's largely what the British have tried to do as well. Create this fantasy that Ukraine will win and just hope that it will. But the only problem is you have to deal with the reality of the Russian army and the Russian industrial base.
It's very much so, as you say. And what what's worrying me right now is the fact, if we talk because we know that the MI6 and the MI5 have been They've been doing these kind of shenanigans for very many years now. The risk of a false flag being always put into place whenever there is talk of a serious peace. I'm talking about the drones. I'm talking about a blown train track. I'm talking about lines in the Baltic Sea severed. I'm talking about Russian agents blowing up ammunition depots in Romania or Slovakia or Czech Republic, I believe. All these things that are basically, I see them as reenactments of the old Gladio networks, where they were trying to create these situations. And obviously, there is no real public pushback amongst the Western voters. There is no real movement within the European Union or Britain who want peace. I mean, there is, if you remember the beginning of the Iraq War, where Tony Blair and George Bush had their little love affair, there were quite immense demonstrations against that war, which was created from an. But today there is more of a silence on the fact that we could be standing on the edge of a cataclysmic war between European Union and the Russian Federation, which would kill and create strife all across the European Union. But still, the citizens here are very complicit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's true. In the Iraq War, there were huge demonstrations, so big that it made the British government anyway really question whether they could go along with it. They could go along with the Americans, and of course Palestine. It was huge global uproar, quite rightly, against what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Huge, but at the same time, the Ukraine war is happening, and there's almost nothing. And I think so people clearly do want to go out and protest against war. Look how much they've done for the Palestinians. But I think it's a sort of combination of that for so many years, Russia has been demonized in the European press. So even the left wing hate Putin. I always never, I mean, I'm on the left economically, but I said, why do they, there's free or affordable healthcare and education in Russia. Yes, it is capitalist, etc. But they just have a complete lack of understanding of Russia. They seem to want it to be like the West, where all the media is run by oligarchs, and you have this increasingly corrupt and incompetent politician like you have in European countries. So you have this historic sort of hatred right throughout society against the Russian government and Putin. And of course, Russia, they did invade technically. So it's very hard for people to, protest the war, if that makes sense. The narrative was never really there. If Russia didn't invade and Ukraine started attacking Donbass and Russia intervened to save the people of Donbass, then maybe it could have been better. Or if the Americans went in. So the narrative is very hard for most people to get over. And of course, if you promote peace, then you're a Putin critic, you're a Putin, all these things. So I think it's been a very difficult war for people to stand up against. But as I say, I know many people who think like I do, but are scared to speak out. But yeah, for a number of reasons, there's been almost no pushback against European NATO narrative. And ultimately, that has done huge damage to our people.
Yes, because there is a funny, when we're talking about ideologies and different political positions, all across the board, from right to left, at least I can speak for Sweden, which I know quite well, there is a unison in the idea that the war must end with a Ukrainian victory. Now, the leftist party in Sweden, which are the old communists but reformed since the 1990s, they are normally against militarization, they are against war, they are against military industrial spending. But when it comes to Ukraine, they're all on board. They
Mhm.
even just recently said that they will not be pushing, because they voted no to Sweden joining NATO, but they recently decided that they will not be pushing Sweden, nor the Greens in Sweden. They will not be pushing for Sweden to leave NATO. And I don't even think that they will be working for Sweden to leave this American agreement on American basis being placed in Sweden. So when it comes to the Ukrainian war, they have gone fully militarized. They're basically, they're war happy Tories for all intents and purposes. And I think it's the same situation in the UK. I mean, you can't tell a Labour prime minister from a Tory prime minister when it comes to continuing the war in Ukraine.
I
So there
think
is, I mean, ideology seems to have gone out the window when it comes to this conflict, funnily enough.
I think one of the reasons for that is the extreme success of the anti-Russian, anti-Putin, if you like, propaganda over the last however long, couple of decades. You know, I've been in Russia for three years pretty much now, in Moscow for 18 months. And it's a wonderful country. As I said, it's in my top 5 favorite European countries. The government is there a more popular government in Europe than, I don't know what Putin is on now, but between 60 and 80% approval rating? You know, and you know, everything's very clean. A lot of corruption, of course, but you know, it's a very normal European city and a wonderful city, one of the greatest. So the characterization of Russia under Putin of being this sort of evil totalitarian state that is a threat to the whole of Europe is just a complete myth. You know, Russia has been involved in wars and conflicts over recent times, just like Britain and the United States, and I think Sweden has been. But they're wars that have been understood. They moved into Syria to fight ISIS, which I'm very happy they did. Ultimately, they had to pull out. The war in Georgia, of course, was actually started by the Georgians, and the conflict in Ukraine. You know, whereas NATO was invading NATO countries are invading Afghanistan, Iraq, you know. So there is a militarism, but you know, but this characterization of Russia being some deep evil threat or some kind of totalitarian state is just absurd. Life in Moscow and in Russia, it feels just as free as in the West. It could be Moscow. I think the buildings look quite Scandinavian. I think. You know, you could be in any kind of European city, Northern or Eastern European city. And so I think that's been so successful. And this kind of idea that the Russian political system is different than the European political system, therefore that we need to be enemies. It has allowed the left to justify their own militarism. And I think that's something that needs to change. You know, Russia, even under Putin, wants to have good relations with Europe, but we've just thrown it away. And the damage to our industry has been huge. The energy prices, the loss of Russian energy has been so damaging, all because we decided to fight Russia rather than be friends and allies. Because this Russian government does want to have good relations with Europe, and anybody who comes to Russia knows it feels like any other European country, and that I think needs to be put into people's heads that the Russian people do not hate the Russian government. So why do the European governments? It doesn't make any sense.
No, it's but that's the difficulty. It's because nothing is allowed to be reported. That's in any way, shape, or form positive about Russia. There is nothing allowed, and even the cultural exchanges are not allowed. At least during the Cold War, you had a lot of cultural exchanges. I was heading out to attend opera with a Russian singer, opera singer, and I think 3 days before the concert was about to proceed, I got a text saying your money has been refunded because we won't proceed with this show or this opera due to the fact that she was Russian. And I mean, when you even stifle that cultural or the ability for culture to move across the borders, it's
I mean,
detrimental.
I have Russian people, particularly more older ones, when they hear that I'm Scottish, they they jump into a full rendition of "My Heart Is in the Highlands" by Robert Burns. Robert Burns is
Ah,
Scotland's national poet. And it was strange sitting on a Russian street and this Russian woman, I don't even know the whole of My Heart is in the Highlands, the poem, but she goes into it. And because it was taught in Soviet schools, I think because Scotland, Robert Burns has a love for the wilds, and Scotland and Russia are very similar in that regard. They love the wilderness. And there's other American writers, I'm sorry, Western writers. Who's the there might even be Swedish artists. I'm sure there are taught.
there is. If you when I lived there in Russia, you know you probably heard of the Swedish author of child books, Astrid Lindgren, Pippi Longstocking, and the
Okay.
kind. There was one book she wrote about Carlson on the roof. Now this is a friendly little chubby fellow with a propeller on his back, who lives on the rooftops of Stockholm, and he befriends a young child and helps him with his troubles in life. Now, this Carlson on the Roof has been it's been on. I think there's even a stamp, a Russian stamp from the 90s with Carlson in Russian. And it's been on the theater, or at least it had been on the theaters for over 30 years, because Carlson was a rabulist. He was a bit of a rebel, but it was still safe to say you liked him. I mean, you couldn't rebel too much within the Soviet system, but Carlson was kind of state-sanctioned rebellious in his nature, so that was fine. And that
Yeah.
was also, I couldn't for the life of me understand why all Russians I met in the beginning wanted to talk about Carlson on the roof. And when I said, well, I lived in those areas in Stockholm, they were, oh, you did. So I mean, that's
Absolutely.
it's
I
and
mean,
it's also a way to connect people. But once you cut these cultural ties, you so quickly do people start to see animosity and enemy looking perceiving each others as enemies.
absolutely. I mean, I live not too far away from the Bolshoi Theatre, the famous Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow. Went to an amazing opera there, Salome, which is,
Mm.
I think, is it German or French? Based on Oscar Wilde's novel.
Yes.
And amazing production. I mean, I love theatre, and it was as good or better than anything you'll see in London. An amazing, amazing production. And so there's still, I mean, Russian people generally really like the West. You know, when I speak to them, they say, oh, because they have a particular love for Scotland. A lot of Russians love Scotland because it's probably the most similar country. I suspect Sweden as well. They love France, Italy, you know, so they don't see hatred from, you know, I was going with a Russian war reporter to the front line in Donetsk, and he said, oh, you're Scottish. I love Scotland. I can't wait when the war's over to go back. You know, and it's so that you don't have that hatred for the West or Western culture in Russia. You're increasingly going to see that, and I think are a wee bit because of this kind of, well, if you don't want to be friends with us, then screw you, and we're going to look towards China. But the Russians still see themselves as Europeans, or at least, you know, the Moscow, St. Petersburg people. So it is very sad that the Europeans are now canceling Russian artists. I mean, frankly, it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic, and it's done on purpose to stop any kind of peace and good relations. And ultimately, that is only damaging European interests, and it's very sad.
Exactly, and on that note, damaging European interests. What has happened now is that if Europe and the European Union had decoupled themselves a bit from the United States and joined forces with Russia earlier on, thereby accepting Russia as it were, not trying to democratize Russia in any way, but accepting Russia and the German powerhouse and the Russian energy had been allowed to continue working, Europe would have been in such a sweet spot. I mean,
Yeah.
Europe is on one edge of the Eurasian continent. What has happened now is that basically the West has forced Russia, and it's as you say, most Russians they don't have any animosities. They would have loved to become part of that European community. But now, for geopolitical reasons, they have been forced to move towards China, which they don't really trust or understand as much as they do Europe. But due to our follies, we have forced them to go to the other end of the Eurasian continent. And this, it's 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 a kind of European political self-hatred that's going to, I mean, it's probably going to destroy my pension fund. What I fear is that I will be hobbling along like those babushkas I saw in the 90s once I reach my retirement age. And you, I mean, you and the Chinese will probably be enjoying stable pension funds by then. I basically see a risk of a European Union economic collapse because America is not going to care for us. America doesn't care for Europe in any
Absolutely.
way.
This is why we started this podcast almost, and I said the importance of patriotism, because I see that I think that's the only force that can really start making Europe act in its own interests. And as I said, I'm a leftist, but increasingly I have sympathy with rightist parties in Europe because they seem to be the ones who are promoting that patriotism and trying to promote the interests and the sovereignty of European countries. And I don't know where I stand with European Union unity. Europe should be united in some kind of way, but the European Union itself has become so corrupt and is not acting for the people that there are serious problems there. And I hope that Europe, can be united in some way. But that's why I say the importance of patriotism and Europe taking back its sovereignty, because as you say, it's not been in European interest to have this split with Russia. It's damaged European interests because European politicians are not acting in the European interests. And I don't know what the intelligence agencies are doing. I say in Russia, the intelligence agencies are very, very powerful, right? In Britain and European intelligence agencies, they have the power to kill, they have the power to ruin lives. And I do think that they, frankly, it sounds quite fascist of me to say it. The leftist, I can't believe I'm saying this. But there needs to be some power base in Europe that takes back power for the politicians and starts making Europe act in their national interests, because that's not happening right now.
No, that's true words that you speak because, as you say, that whole left-right scale has been it's been obliterated when it comes to these matters of a geopolitical economic future. Within our club, I come from a very liberal background, but I'm now in full agreement with old Swedish Stalinist communists who, I mean, we've all mellowed out with age, but we've come to a conclusion that what's happening now is just detrimental to all citizens. We have to fix this first, and then we can bicker about who does what and in what way a state function should be like, and so on. But we're on very thin ice and dangerous grounds, and especially considering America's position right now, it's
That's true. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of, actually, at least on my following on X, I have a big following on X. And I think I follow people right across the political spectrum, from communists to MAGA Republicans to African nationalists, all sorts of people. And the people who message me, people in Russia and the West message me to meet up for coffee if they're in Moscow, just people follow me on X. And it's sometimes they're real hardcore leftists, sometimes they're very right, socially conservatives. And they all appreciate, my work. And so you're right that this left and right divide is not the most important thing in Europe at the moment. It's getting back sovereignty for our people.
yes, and I think you've probably been accused of the same I've been accused of, which frankly I'm quite proud of. I mean, I've been called a fascist, I've been called a Nazi, I've been called a communist, I've been called a socialist, I've been called an environmentalist, fundamentalist. I mean, every part of the spectrum, different people have applied these labels to me. But I've just stayed within an idea of that there has to be a peaceful solution to these problems. And it's amazing what labels people can stick to you based on just wanting peace and prosperity, more or less.
Well, it's a form of tribalism. Tribalism is so important to people. People don't even realize they're in a tribe. Um, you kind of have a tribe that you fit to. And increasingly, people like myself and yourself are, not within any tribe, just trying to find the best practical solutions going forward. But the liberals are in a tribe, the rightists are in a tribe, all these different things, and that tribalism is still very much alive and well, of course.
Yes. Well, on those words, I think we best round up our little discussion on this dissident podcast. I think about an hour of two highly, slightly scruffy, bearded, middle-aged men is about all that our listeners can take.
So
But if
I'm doing a recorded TV interview on Thursday, and I'm going to have a haircut before that. So I apologize that I look very scruffy today. I really make an effort. I apologize.
haircut, my 83-year-old mother will be coming here for Christmas, so I have to head down to the barber's and get this figured out before she arrives. So
Yeah.
I think we have to do that. But anyway, you can follow Johnny Miller on X, and my great gratitude for your time, and it was an interesting discussion, and
No
hopefully
problem at all.
more
Yeah.
people will now realize who you are
Yeah.
and listen to your wisdoms.
Great. Well, always great to speak to you, Matt. Thanks so much,
Yep.
and I'm sure we'll speak
Thank
again
you.
soon. Okay.